Thank you for being here with us today. Welcome in person, and of course we have our virtual audience. We'd like to thank you for being with us for this conference, 75 years of partition, dispossession, and ethnic cleansing. And before we start our program, I would like to acknowledge that we live now on the ancestral lands of the indigenous Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. I would like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues, Ruqayya and Firas, for their hard work and commitment to making today successful. Our interns, George, Asil, Max, and Noor, have been integral to today's success as well. Each of them has written a blog relevant to today's topics, and we will post their blogs during lunchtime. So please visit our website and read their blogs that they worked really hard on. I would like to also take this opportunity to thank our Palestine Center Committee and our Board of Directors, who also have been an integral part of the process leading to today. On the last page of the program booklet, which you have in your folders, you will find our upcoming activities until March 2023. And in December, we have two main events. We have on December 9, to coincide with the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, we will have a symposium on international protection for the Palestinian people. And we have three phenomenal women who will be speaking. Special Rapporteur Albanese, Professor Francesca Ferris, and Ambassador Fidel Abdelhadi. Another event we will have in December is our annual bazaar. And since I've come to DC, every single person I've met at any event has asked me about our bazaars. So December 10, and come and bring your families. And please check our website for final dates for the other events from January to March. And also in your folders, you will find our Giving Tuesday announcement, as well as our last appeal for this year. Please continue to contribute to the work of the Jerusalem Fund and the Palestine Center so we can continue to have our events and give grants to various organizations across Palestine and in the diaspora. And thank you for your contributions. I will now hand over to our chairman, Dr. Subhi Ali, for the opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam. Good morning. We can do better. Good morning. Much better. Welcome to the 2022 Palestine Center Annual Conference. We have not been in this auditorium actually for 3 years. Everybody knows why. Thank you for joining us today. We are happy to be back in person for our events and look forward to having all of you with us, as well as our virtual audience. This year's conference and the month of November mark both the 105th year since the Balfour Declaration and 75 years since the United Nations Partition Plan of Palestine. Our conference title is 75 years of partition, dispossession, and ethnic cleansing. On November 29th, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly proposed and adopted UN Resolution 181, which essentially became the United Nations Partition Plan for Palestine. The plan recommended a partition of mandatory Palestine at the end of the British mandate. The declaration and partition of the plan signed away the fate of a sovereign land and entire people, Zionist settler colonial project. A project that emerged as the State of Israel, forcibly displacing and ethnically cleansing the Palestinian people, which continues today. In 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, said, quote, "We must do everything to ensure that they, the Palestinians, never do return. The old will die and the young will forget." Our conference today and the events that came before in this center and by the Palestine Center are planned in order to prove that that was a dream by Ben-Gurion. It's far away from reality. A few weeks ago, we hosted some of the authors and editors of Light in Gaza, Writing Born of Fire, and one of the most significant issues within our important anthology was Palestinian refugees. A classification and status that continues today because of the partition plan. The anthology challenged readers to go beyond the permission to narrate, in that knowledge requires responsibility. In addition to our keynote speaker, Professor Joseph Massad, a friend of the Jerusalem Fund, our panels today will begin with ethnic cleansing, to be followed by human rights, and will end with analysis and action. The planning of the panels in that order actually was intentional. We anticipate that by the end of the conference today, the concrete actions will be proposed and discussed for you to decide how to take this matter forward. In each of the panels, speakers will present for 15 minutes. This will be followed by another 15 minutes of questions and answers. We have allocated also additional time during the closing remarks for questions. If you would like to ask a question, please wait until we call on you and a staff member hands you a microphone. Some general remarks. One, please silence your phone. I've already done mine. As many times I ask the audience to silence their phones, and mine, of course, will ring. For those who want to join the conversation about the conference on Twitter, use the hashtag TCConf2022. You can also retweet and like tweets posted by our Twitter handle @Palestine Center. We will have 2 coffee breaks, and lunch will be served at 12:30. Please refer to the conference booklet for details. We have also books by some of our speakers outside in the hall for sale for those who would like to purchase some, as well as some kufiyas. Our Wi-Fi code is Palestine Center Guest. The password is PC Guest, and you can see the signs in the conference room. This year's conference will be moderated by members of the Palestine Center Committee. Please see their bios of all the moderators as well as the speakers in the program. I will now hand the microphone to Dr. Eid Mustafa, our capable treasurer and vice chairman, who will be the MC of the conference for the rest of the day. Thank you. And please watch for this.
Sure. Good morning. Now that Dr. Ali woke you up, I will get right into it. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you again and to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Massad needs no introduction, but I will say a few things about him. Dr. Massad is a professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University. He's the author of several books, dozens of scholarly articles, and hundreds of op-eds. His books include Colonial Effects, The Making of National Identity in Jordan, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, Desiring Arabs, and Islam in Liberalism. His forthcoming book is tentatively titled The Age of Independence, A Settler Colonial History of the World. That's bound to be something else. He is a recipient of a number of research and teaching awards, including the Lionel Trilling Book Award for his book Desiring Arabs, the Scott Nearing Award for Courageous Scholarship, and the Columbia University Faculty Mentoring Award. His works have been translated into more than a dozen languages, including Arabic, Turkish, Persian, French, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Swedish, Japanese, Chinese, German, and Indonesian. I don't know what's that. Please help me give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. This is the second time that I get to give a keynote at the Palestine Center, which is a great pleasure and honor. The title today of my talk is Jewish Self-Determination in the Land of the Palestinians. Last month, the Anti-Defamation League, one of the most fanatical pro-Israeli US organizations, issued a report reiterating the relatively novel definition of Zionism as, and I quote, the movement for self-determination and statehood of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel, unquote. As the ADL report continues, as anti-Zionism rejects Israel as a legitimate member of the community of nations and denies the right for Jews to self-determination and to establish a state in the land of Israel, anti-Zionism is, and I'm quoting, anti-Semitic in intent or effect, unquote. Not to be outdone, the director of the Turo Institute on Human Rights and the Holocaust, Professor Ann Bayevsky, goes further when condemning the recent report from last week issued by the UN Commission of Inquiry of Israel. Likening the UN to the Spanish Inquisition in a paper published by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, Bayevsky asserts that, quote, the inquisitors decided that the murder of 6 million Jews who didn't have self-determination and the protection of a Jewish state were irrelevant to the UN inquiry into Israeli violations of Palestinian human rights. It seems that not granting Jewish colonists in Palestine Jewish self-determination has now become the primary cause of the Holocaust. And indeed, by Bayevsky's logic, it is the Holocaust which explains, if not justifies, the ongoing Israeli violation of the Palestinians' human rights, which presumably is why she faults the UN Commission of Inquiry for ignoring it in its report. Bayevsky concludes that, quote, the UN inquiry and its creators, enablers, and mandate holders are bent on the demonization and delegitimization of Israel and the self-determination of the Jewish people, the face of modern anti-Semitism, unquote. These are hardly new lines of argumentation, but they acquire special importance in the wake of the 2018 Israeli Basic Law, the so-called nation-state law, which stipulates as many of you know, that, and I quote, that the land of Israel is the historical homeland of the Jewish people in which the state of Israel was established, and that the state of Israel is the national home of the Jewish people in which it fulfills its natural, cultural, religious, and historical right to self-determination. And finally, the law tells us that, quote, the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people, unquote. But it is not only Israel and its Israeli and US lobbying organizations that deploy the term, so do pro-Israeli American academics, as does Michael Walzer, for example, who claims outlandishly, not to mention anachronistically, that the outcome of the Zionist establishment of the Jewish settler colony means that, quote, today, Jewish self-determination, impossible for almost 2,000 years, is an everyday fact, unquote. The Europe-based International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, whose definition of anti-Semitism has been adopted by the US and the EU, also insists that, quote, denying the Jewish people the right to self-determination, example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, unquote, is a form of anti-Semitism. Unlike these recent Zionist claims, the indigenous Palestinians had put forth their claim and right to national self-determination since the end of World War I, when that right was introduced internationally, beginning with the Palestinian appeals to the Paris Peace Conference, a right the Palestinians continued to invoke in the face of ongoing British and Zionist denials. The increasing use by Israel of the so-called right of Jewish self-determination as having always been foundational to the Zionist movement and to Jewish settler colonialism in Palestine, and as a basis for denying Palestinian self-determination is, however, and as I will show today, belied by the historical record. Whence then came the question of Jewish self-determination as the principal argument deployed by Israel, its laws, and its US allies and academic marketers against the right of the indigenous Palestinians' right to self-determination. The term first appeared in Hebrew as a translation from the Russian as the right of self-definition, or hazechut lehagdara atzmit, and began to be deployed during the terrorist war that the Zionist militias launched against the British mandatory authorities from the early 1940s through 1948. Not unlike the rise of the concept among South African white colonial settlers following the Boer War with the British, and which led to the establishment of the Union of South Africa in 1910 as a British dominion with white self-government, European Jewish colonists began to use self-determination in earnest when they parted ways with their British colonial sponsors. The Zionist ideologues, since the inception of their war against the Palestinian people, did not, however, argue for Jewish self-determination, but rather sought to delegitimize the indigenous Palestinians' right to it. In the tradition of all colonial powers, which denied that the colonized were a nation, the Zionists began with denying the nationness of the Palestinians, while affirming the then recent Zionist invention of Jewish nationness. The denial of the nationness of the Palestinians would lead, of course, to the denial of the right to self-determination. Remember, Churchill would say that India was as much of a country as the equator, for example. The French would deny that the Algerians were ever a people, and they were just divided into different kinds of tribes and ethnic groups, as would the British say about the Egyptians. So there's nothing special, of course, in this denial. Embarrassed as a self-identified socialist Zionist that the Zionist project was denying the indigenous Palestinians the right to self-determination, the leading Zionist colonist, Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who later became, of course, the second president of the State of Israel, argued as early as 1921 that only the Bedouins among the Palestinians were actually of pure Arab racial stock. The rest of the natives were simply peasants and urbanites that did not make up a national grouping. I'm quoting. Unlike the European Jewish colonists who issued, now the quote is over. Unlike Jewish colonists who issued from a motley of European and non-European countries, and who, in his opinion, did constitute a national grouping. These arguments, of course, were identical to those made by the British and the French, as I've just said. But for Ben-Zvi, the Palestinian natives, and I quote again, were Arabs in language and culture, but by origin and race are mixed and composed of different elements. As is proven by its national, religious, and racial composition, the population of this country is not of one national character and do not constitute a single nation. An enemy to the Jewish people, or what he called then Israel, which was, as I will explain, only meant the Jewish people. So they did not constitute an enemy to the Jewish people as a new nation in the country. On the contrary, this population is composed of different religious and national groups, each of which has more or less definite national character, unquote. Ben-Zvi asserted, as would Ben-Gurion, also that the Palestinian peasants were in fact descendants of the ancient rural Hebrew Jewish population, who later adopted the language and culture and religion of their Arab conquerors. It is unclear if intermarriage with Arab Muslim conquerors and the resulting miscegenation might have been the operative criterion for him to deny them their collective national identity. The Zionist organization, sometimes anachronistically identified as the World Zionist Organization, the WZO as such was added in 1960. Before that, it was always known as the Zionist Organization, or the ZO. The Zionist organization argued that based on biological descent, or the fantastical anti-Semitic claims that Jews have across history formed one race and shared one blood, rendering them one people and one nationality, European Jews have a claim to the land of the Palestinians. This was the argument that the ZO delegation to the Paris Peace Conference presented, but without ever invoking a Jewish right to self-determination. Their claim was, and I quote, that the land is the historic home of the Jews, and through the ages, they have never ceased to cherish the longing and the hope of a return, unquote. The way the Zionist organization constructed the argument is through tracing its claim of biological heredity to the ancient Hebrews, and that the Hebrews, as alleged progenitors of modern European Jews, were allegedly in exclusive possession of the right to the land over all of what had become mandatory Palestine, which the Hebrews had transmitted to modern Jews through the bloodline. Zionism's project was thus to claim European Jews' right to the land of the Palestinians based on the Christian and later anti-Semitic and now nationalist claim of a common blood among all Jews. These were ideas, of course, put forth by German racial biologists, people, anti-Semites, of course, people like Houston Chamberlain and Eugen Düring at that time, which were hugely influential on the thoughts of the founders of Zionism, people like Arthur Buchan and others. So the anti-Semites, of course, had accused the Jews at the time of being Asiatic, Semitic, and certainly not European. In contradistinction to the Zionists, the Palestinians have always invoked the right to the land as the basis of their anti-colonial claim against Zionism. This was, of course, the case since the inception of the Zionist threat, especially following the Balfour Declaration, which crucially, of course, was issued by the government of Lloyd George, who was a champion of self-determination, but only in the former German settler colonies. It is most interesting to note in this regard that unlike the post-mandate use by the Zionists of the concept of self-determination, neither the Balfour Declaration of 1917 nor the Palestine Mandate of 1922 employed the language of rights, let alone of the right to self-determination for Jewish colonial settlers, even as the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate were granting Jews the land of the Palestinians. Whereas some Zionists claim that Palestinians lack common descent, as they share share blood and ethnicity with other Arabs and even non-Arabs, and therefore lack particularity as a Palestinian nation, which was Ben-Zvi's argument, others like Vladimir Jabotinsky were willing to concede the right of the Palestinians to their own land, but explained that such a right was in conflict with the colonizing Jews' superior, because allegedly historical and ancient right to the land, which created a hierarchy of priorities. The priority to the rights of the colonizing Jews was established through a right of conquest based on a theory of alleged origins and historical longevity, not to mention that as modern Europeans, colonizing Jews were developing the land which lay fallow in the hands of the natives. Jabotinsky conceived of the issue in European supremacist terms. Let me quote him for you. A civilized Jew immigrates to Asia in the same way that a civilized Englishman immigrates to Australia. He transports Europe within himself to the land of Israel and contributes to the development of a 2,000-year-old European heritage, which is close to his heart, absorbed into his blood. To our neighbors in Asia, we wish the same thing, the liquidation of the Orient as fast as possible, unquote. This was also David Ben-Gurion's early reasoning about the matter. In 1924, he explicitly referred to the Palestinians' right of self-determination. Something is wrong with the microphone. It's okay. I mean, maybe I just should put it away or farther away from it. No? Okay. Can you still hear me? No? Okay, all right. This was also David Ben-Gurion's early reasoning about the matter. In 1924, he explicitly referred to the Palestinians' right of self-determination. Let me quote him. The Arab community in the country has the right of self-determination, of self-rule. It would never occur to us to restrict or minimize that right. The national autonomy which we demand for ourselves, we demand for the Arabs as well. But we do not admit the right to rule over the country to the extent that the country is not built up by them and still awaits those who will work it. They do not have any right to claim to prohibit or control the construction of the country, the restoration of its ruins, the productivization of its resources, the expansion of its cultivated area, the development of its culture, or the growth of its laboring community, unquote. In a letter to the British Assistant Under-Secretary of State, Sir John Schackburg, in March 1930, Chaim Weizmann, the head of the Zionist organization and later the first president of Israel, invoked his opposition to Palestinian self-determination, affirming that the rights, and I quote, the rights that the Jewish people has been adjudged in Palestine by the British mandate do not depend on the consent and cannot be subject to the will of the majority of its inhabitants. But of course, unquote. Weizmann was clear that when the British promised the Zionists a national home in Palestine, quote, the agreement of the Palestinian Arabs was not asked, unquote. The reason for why Palestinian consent was of no import, he added, was on account of the, quote, uniqueness of the Jewish connection to Palestine. He further claimed that as Arabs were being granted self-determination in neighboring states like Iraq, they could not be allowed to stand in the way of Jewish colonial aspirations in Palestine. The Palestinians themselves could not, quote, be considered as owning the country in the sense in which the inhabitants of Iraq or Egypt possessed their respective countries, unquote. To grant Palestinian self-determination or self-government, or as he put it, and I quote, a legislative assembly would be to assign the country to its present inhabitants and to cancel, in an, and I quote, in an underhand manner, the Balfour Declaration's commitment to a Jewish national home in the land of the Palestinians. Meeting in the Biltmore Hotel in New York in May 1942, the Zionists issued their infamous political program for the final takeover of the country of the Palestinians. Attended by 600 American Jews and 67 foreign Zionist Jews, including Weizmann and Ben-Gurion, the conference program asserted that, quote, in the course of the past 20 years, the Jewish people have awakened and transformed their ancient homeland. From 50,000 at the end of the last war, their numbers have increased to more than 500,000. They have made the waste places to bear fruit and the desert to blossom. Their pioneering achievements in agriculture and in industry, embodying new patterns of cooperative endeavor, have written a notable page in the history of colonization, unquote. The program further called, and I quote it again, called for the fulfillment of the original purpose of the Balfour Declaration and the mandate, which, recognizing the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine, was to afford them the opportunity, as stated by President Wilson, to found there a Jewish commonwealth, unquote. The Zionist movement has often argued that establishing a Jewish state for world Jewry was a moral and historical necessity that must be protected and enshrined in law, something it tirelessly pursued over the decades. However, ironically, the language of rights was never employed by the main documents that Zionism generated, nor the ones it obtained from the world powers until 1948. Zionists would argue more recently that Zionism was nothing less than the movement of Jewish national liberation or of Jewish self-determination, and that the Jews of Palestine sought independence, quote unquote, notions that were in fact absent from Zionism's major documents all along. In his two foundational texts, The State of the Jews, Der Judenstaat, and Old New Land, or Altneuland, Theodor Herzl, the father of Zionism, never invoked the notion of Jewish rights to argue for a state and for a state and for the Jews, whether in Palestine or Argentina, the other location he proposed. Herzl did speak of a solution to the Jewish question, but not of a right. And neither did the first Zionist Congress Herzl convened in 1897, and the Basel program it issued cite such a right. This also applies to the three international foundational texts that Zionism worked hard to obtain. The first such text, the Balfour Declaration, rather than use the language of rights, used the language of affect, promising that the British government, and I quote, views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a Jewish national home, and that its declaration was, quote, a declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, unquote. This was followed by the Mandate for Palestine, issued in 1922 by the Council of the League of Nations, which based itself on the Balfour Declaration and also did not recognize any Jewish rights to a state or even to Palestine. What it did recognize was, quote, the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine as, quote, the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country, unquote. Again, asserting, like the Balfour Declaration before it, that this should not prejudice the rights of non-Jews. So the only time the word rights was actually used was in relation to non-Jews, but not to Jews. The third and more major text, the November 1947 UN Partition Plan Resolution, whose 75th anniversary is this month, proceeded from a moral preamble, namely that the General Assembly considered, and I quote, that the present situation in Palestine is one which is likely to impair the general welfare and friendly relations among nations, and hence the need to provide a solution to the problem of Palestine. Unlike these Zionist and international foundational documents, which did not employ the language of Jewish rights, the Zionist movement insisted on its use in its own foundational document of the state, namely Israel's declaration, namely Israel's so-called Declaration of Independence, formally titled the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel. The declaration, signed by 37 Jewish leaders, 35 of whom were European colonists who came from Plonsk, Lodz, Poltava, Pinsk, and Kaunas, while the remaining two were Yemeni and the Moroccan Jew, included only one signatory, Bechor Shalom Shitrit, who was born in Palestine to a Moroccan colonist family that arrived in the 1880s. The declaration, which however never mentions any Jewish right to self-determination, misinforms us that, quote, in the year 1897, the summons of the spiritual father of the Jewish state, Theodor Herzl, the first Zionist Congress convened and proclaimed the right of the Jewish people, to national rebirth in its own country, unquote. As the documentary record shows, neither Herzl nor the Zionist Congress proclaimed such a right at all. The Basel program stated clearly and simply that, quote, Zionism seeks for the Jewish people a publicly recognized, legally secured homeland in Palestine, unquote. Yet the 1948 Zionist Declaration proceeds to tell us that, quote, this right was recognized in the Balfour Declaration of the 2nd November 1917 and reaffirmed in the mandate of the League of Nations, which in particular gave international sanction to the historic connection between the Jewish people and Eretz Israel, and to the right of the Jewish people to rebuild its national home. On the 29th of November 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Eretz Israel. The General Assembly required the inhabitants of Eretz Israel to take such steps as were necessary on their part for the implementation of that resolution. This recognition by the United Nations of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable, unquote. But as none of these documents had affirmed such a right at all, indeed that the idea that any people should have a right to a state does not even exist in international law, the imputation to them that they did falls more in the realm of a Zionist investment in the new language of international relations, within which within which the notion of rights became enshrined after World War II, not least in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, issued 7 months after Israel's own declaration. Israel's declaration of the establishment of the state is so invested in this mode of argumentation that it invokes the European Enlightenment's notion of natural rights when it asserts in its preamble that, quote, this right to a Jewish state is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations in their own sovereign state, unquote. The framers of the declaration conclude, and I quote again, by virtue of our natural and historic right, and on the strength of the resolution of the UN General Assembly, hereby declare the establishment of the Jewish state in Eretz Israel to be known as the State of Israel. It is important here to point out that the logic of this document is its insistence that its invocation of the Jews' right to establish a Jewish state in Palestine has a clear and moral genealogy, of which it is merely the conclusion, and that such a right was finally granted irrevocably by the partition plan. That none of this was true did not deter the colonial settler framers who, in asserting a right they arrogated to themselves, were now instituting a mode of argumentation that would be the most powerful rhetoric in establishing Israeli facts on the ground. Nonetheless, as is clear from these foundational texts, what was being invoked is not some so-called right of the Jewish people to self-determination, but rather the right of the Jews, conceived as a nation by turn-of-the-century Zionism and anti-Semitism, and as a race whose bloodline is traceable to the ancient Hebrews, to the land of the Palestinians. This is important, since the ADL declaration with which I began today insists that it is not the right of Jewish self-determination as such, which the anti-Zionists deny, but rather its exercise in the land of the Palestinians, which the ADL, of course, calls the land of Israel, and not even the state of Israel. It is also important for Michael Walzer's claim, which asserts that the Jews, through a direct bloodline going back to the Hebrews, had been denied Jewish self-determination for a whopping 2,000 years. The declaration of the establishment of the Jewish state was named as such after proposals to name it Declaration of Independence were turned down by the Zionist leaders. It was the Zionist Communist Party delegate, Meir Vilner, who proposed that the state be declared sovereign and independent, but his amendment was turned down. He even proposed that the Jewish People's Council that declared the state explicitly state its support for, quote, the right of both peoples, meaning the Palestinian natives and the Jewish settlers, to self-determination and to independent states of their own. These proposals were rejected outright in favor of declaring the state Jewish and nothing more, and without mention of any people's self-determination, let alone of independence. The reasons for rejecting terms like independence had to do with the main purpose of Zionism, namely that their state would be the state of the Jewish people worldwide, not only of the Jewish colonists in Palestine. Declaring the state independent and sovereign would have implied that it was independent of world Jewry, and therefore that it was an Israeli rather than a Jewish state. In view of Israel's leaders' insistence that the Zionist movement continue its settler colonial activities, even though a Jewish state had been established, as the majority of Jews remained outside Israel, the question of independence might have precluded it from doing so. Such reasons would be made explicit in subsequent debates about the refusal to call the state independent officially. Moreover, the name to be given to the Jewish state was coined late, only on May 12, 1948, 2 days before the state was declared. The debate about what to name the state preceded the partition resolution, but no decision had been made despite the many proposals, which included Judea, Zion, Zion usually meant Jerusalem, Yeshurun, Eber, from which Hebrew or Hebrew comes from. The name State of Israel was only accepted in April and officially adopted on May 12th by a committee that included the Belarusian colonist David Remez and Bechor Shalom Shitri, whom I mentioned earlier. The choice of what to name the state is said to have been first proposed by the Ukrainian colonist Aharon Shimshelevitz, later Reuveni, the brother of Yitzhak ben Tzvi. Calling the country the State of Israel, or Medinat Yisrael, wherein Israel, the name given to the biblical Jacob after he struggled with the angel of God, refers to the Jewish people, Jacob's descendants, was of course a deliberate choice. The coiners refused to call it the land of Israel, as that would be confusing, since the state until then was going to be established only on part of the land of Israel. So they could not call it the land of Israel. The name of the state would facilitate the Zionist tarnishing of anyone who opposed the state of Israel or the state of the Jewish people, as it meant, with anti-Semitism in the decades to come, as the ADL recently reiterated. The recent deployment of the so-called right of the Jewish people to self-determination in the so-called state of the Jewish people neatly follows the same logic. On 30th November 1947, the day after the UN General Assembly passed the Partition Plan, the Zionists set out to conquer all the territories granted them in the plan and then some. The Zionist expulsion, already theorized by Herzl in the late 1890s and planned by Weizmann, Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion, and others since the 1920s and 1930s, was put into action. The Jewish Agency, the main Zionist organ in charge of advancing Jewish colonization of Palestine, set up its first population transfer committee in November 1937, after the British Peel Commission recommended expelling 250,000 Palestinians from areas it designated for the colonizing Jews. We should all bear in mind that the first official suggestion that Palestinians should be forcefully expelled was actually at the behest of the British in the Peel Commission in 1937. The Transfer Committee's mission was to strategize the forceful expulsion of the Palestinians. A second Zionist Popular Transfer Committee was established in 1941, and the third during the Zionist conquest in May 1948. The problem with the Zionist expulsion plans was that, unlike the 1937 British Peel Commission, which called for the expulsion of the Palestinians and takeover of their lands, private lands, and which the British government ultimately rejected, the 1947 UN Partition Plan forbade both explicitly. If the Peel Commission wanted private and public lands stolen and populations expelled, the UN Partition Plan proposed to divide only state lands between the Jewish colonists and the Palestinian natives, giving the colonists, who by then constituted 30% of the population, 57% of them. It also stipulated that the city of Jerusalem, of course, would be, as most of you know, a corpus separatum under UN jurisdiction. But unlike the Peel Commission, the UN plan explicitly forbade confiscation of private land and the expulsion of populations. The Zionists accepted the UN Partition Plan, except that they violated all its precepts and treated it as if it were an expansive version of the Peel Commission report, but now ratified by the United Nations. The UN Partition Plan stated clearly, and I quote, that no discrimination of any kind shall be made between the inhabitants on the ground of race, religion, language, or sex, and that no expropriation of land owned by an Arab in the Jewish state or by a Jew in the Arab state shall be allowed, except for public purposes. In all cases of expropriation, full compensation as fixed by the Supreme Court shall be set previous to dispossession, unquote. When the Israeli declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel was issued, the Zionist forces had already expelled about 400,000 Palestinians from their lands, and they would expel another 360,000 in the coming months. From this, it follows clearly that not only is Israel's claim to establish a Jewish state that established demographic majority by ethnic cleansing was not advocated by the Partition Plan, but that it was in violation of it, and was rather authorized by the recommendations of the rejected Peel Commission report. The proposed partition plan, on which Israel based its establishment initially, envisioned a Jewish state with an Arab majority, which it later modified slightly to include only 45% Arab population. And therefore, it never envisioned the Jewish state as ethnically cleansed of Arabs, or Arab-Arain, perhaps. In 1946, the population of Palestine was under 2 million people, or more exactly, 1,972,000, of whom 1,364,000 were Palestinians and 608,000 Jewish colonists, mostly Jewish colonists. According to the plan, the population of the Arab state would consist of 818,000 Palestinian Arabs and less than 10,000 Jews. The proposed Jewish state would consist of 499,000 Jewish colonists and 438,000 Palestinian Arabs. Had the city of Jaffa, with its 71,000 Palestinians, been included in the Jewish state, as the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, which actually drafted the partition plan, had originally proposed, the Palestinians would have also outnumbered Jews in the Jewish state. The UN Corpus Separatum of Jerusalem, which lay outside the two states, included 105,000 Palestinians versus 100,000 Jews. So Palestinians would have been a majority actually in all three partition areas of Palestine. As Palestine was divided into 16 districts, 9 of which were located in the proposed Jewish state, Palestinian Arabs were a majority in 15 of the 16 districts, and had the enclave of the city of Jaffa continued to be included in the Jewish state, they would have also been a majority in all 16 of them. In none of the 16 sub-districts, of course, let alone in the 9 designated as the Jewish state, did the Jewish colonists own a majority of the land. Their ownership, in fact, ranged between the largest sum, which is 39% in the Tel Aviv Jaffa district, to mostly less than 1% in many districts, including Negev and other areas, and Jenin. The Zionist movement understood the contradictions of the partition plan well, and based on that understanding, it set out to expel most of the Arab population in accordance with the Peel Commission's recommendations. The Jewish colonists' subsequent deployment of the concept of independence rhetorically, even though they rejected it as a legal category for their state, was a precursor to the subsequent deployment of the so-called right of Jewish self-determination. It is in this vein that the 1948 Declaration and the preceding Zionist war against the British and the Palestinians would be referred to in Israel and outside it as both a declaration of independence and then the War of Independence. In the Jewish campaign against the British between 1944 and 1948, which the British described as a terrorist war, 44 to 50 Jews were killed, compared to 338 Britons, a ratio of 6-to-1 in favor of the Zionists. As historian Walid Khalidi put it, and I quote him, "This is an unheard of ratio in the annals of colonial warfare between the regular army and the rebels in all wars of independence." Nonetheless, as the age of decolonization was blossoming after World War II, Zionist propagandists sought to integrate themselves as anti-colonialists in fighting Britain in a manner not unlike how the Boers, let alone white Americans, saw themselves as fighting British colonialism. The conquest of the territory of the prospective Palestinian state, however, presented a problem when Israel submitted a membership application to the United Nations on the first anniversary of Resolution 181. We're speaking here about November 1948, while it still occupied Palestinian and UN territories. The Security Council reviewed Israel's application and adopted Resolution 69 on 5th March 1949, recommending that the General Assembly admit Israel as, quote, a peace-loving state, unquote. The vote at the Security Council, which recommended recognition, was 9-to-1 in favor, with Egypt opposing. The United Kingdom abstained, as it had done on Resolution 181 in 1947. The General Assembly, in turn, was reluctant to admit Israel until it responded to queries regarding its violations of 2 UN resolutions. This related to Israel's refusal to declare official boundaries, its occupation of half the territory allocated to the Palestinian state, its occupation of UN-administered West Jerusalem, and its refusal to allow Palestinian refugees to return to their homes inside the territory on which Israel established itself, along with its refusal to compensate the refugees for lost property, as stipulated by the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 194. Resolution 194 also established, of course, the UN Conciliation Commission on Palestine, which was during this period negotiating with Israel on the demarcation of its borders. Israel's ambassador, the South African-born Aubrey Solomon, who later renamed himself Abba Ibn, responded to the queries on 5th May 1949. He assured the General Assembly that the matter of Israel's boundaries could be resolved through, quote, a process of peaceful adjustment of the territorial provisions laid down in Resolution 181, and that the adjustment should be made not by arbitrary changes imposed from outside, but through agreements freely negotiated by the governments concerned, unquote. Even added that the refugee problem could not be settled before the issue of borders is settled through separate negotiations with each Arab state, and that Israel would not be able to negotiate effectively without first becoming a member of the UN. Quite a smart fellow. On Jerusalem, even stated that Israel would have favored UN jurisdiction were it not for the Arab states' armed resistance and the refusal of the UN to take control of the area. He clarified that Israel would cooperate with the UN, however, to establish control over all the holy places in the city, most of which, of course, at the time were in Jordanian-occupied East Jerusalem. Based on these assurances, the UN General Assembly admitted Israel as a member on 11th May 1949 by a vote of 37-12, adopting UNGA Resolution 273. But the resolution stipulated that Israel must abide by resolutions 181 and 194, which means until today, in fact, there's a legal basis to overturn the UN recognition of Israel because it remains in violation of both resolutions. But, 9 countries, including the United Kingdom, abstained on the resolution. Neither the Security Council nor the General Assembly resolutions made any mention of Jewish self-determination. That would not surprise you, I suspect. The next day, the United Nations Conciliation Commission on Palestine held a conference in Lausanne, attended by Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, during which Israel refused to repatriate or compensate the Palestinian refugees and proposed to annex all the territories it occupied illegally as a form of bilateral territorial adjustment. The Arab states rejected this, of course, as they understood that the Israeli proposal involved, and I'm quoting, involved annexations rather than territorial adjustments, unquote. Indeed, Israel considered the territories it conquered from the projected Palestinian state and the UN territory of Jerusalem as part of Israel, even though the only international document that granted Israel any form of legitimacy were the boundaries stipulated by the General Assembly Resolution 181, of which it remained in violation. This is why, despite increasing pressure from the US, Britain was adamant not to recognize Israel, arguing that it would only do so after the frontiers of the state shall be clearly defined. This led the US representative at the UN to argue that when his country gained independence in 1776, and I quote, the land had not even been fully explored, and that no one knew where American claims ended and where European states' claims began, unquote. It would seem that white European settler colonies are the same, whether established in the 18th or the 20th century. A British de facto recognition of Israel would only come on 30th January 1949, but it took place as a result of hard bargaining with the US. The US, under Zionist pressure, had refused to recognize Jordan's independence from Britain in May 1946, as the Zionists were not yet fully decided on how much of Jordan they might want to conquer as part of the Jewish state. The British, however, needed to protect their client state and its leader, the recently self-proclaimed King Abdullah. He had been emir and in 1946 appointed himself as king, who had reached an understanding with the Israelis to keep the eastern and central parts of Palestine that his British-led army had captured at the end of the war. Later that year, on the 5th of December, so basically, ultimately, when the US agreed to recognize Jordan to safeguard it from Zionist conquest, the UK recognized Israel. So it was a very interesting kind of a swap in terms of recognition. Later that year, on the 5th of December 1949, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion unilaterally annexed West Jerusalem and declared that Israel was no longer bound by Resolution 181, not only with regards to the Palestinian territories it had conquered, but also with regards to UN control of West Jerusalem. France introduced a motion to censure Israel at the UN, most likely on account of its missionary interests in the city. The UN General Assembly issued Resolution 303 4 days later, declaring that Jerusalem would be placed under a permanent international regime. Israel rejected the resolution, and on 14th December, moved Ben-Gurion's offices and the Knesset from Tel Aviv to West Jerusalem. Ben-Gurion declared, and I quote, Jerusalem always has been and always will be the capital of Israel. Remember, here Israel also means the Jewish people, right? That doesn't just mean Israel, the state. Britain recognized Israel de jure on the 27th of April, 1950, while still voicing its reservations on the question of borders, including Jerusalem. France, which had provided arms to the Zionists in the late 1940s and a French loan to Israel in 1950, did not upgrade its legation in Israel to an embassy until September 1952. At the time, it was because of its ongoing war in Algeria and in the hope that Israel would actually help France in its ongoing attempt to keep Algeria. This would become more explicit after 1954. The Zionists never justified any of these conquests or annexations by appeal to any right of Jews to self-determination, but insistently on the Jews' so-called historic right to the land based on their alleged bloodline as heirs to the ancient Hebrews. Since its inception, the Zionist project to colonize Palestine has been determined and uncompromising in its colonial settler goals. But at the same time, it demonstrated ideological innovation and acrobatics in packaging its takeover of the country of the Palestinians. While the initial goal was to create a colonial Jewish majority in Palestine, successfully achieved for a few decades through the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in 1948 and 1967, Zionists have more recently had to face the old new reality of Jews as a minority in their own colonial settler state. This is where the question of Jewish self-determination and explicit claims of Jewish supremacy became necessary again to assert Zionist colonial claims. In the 1970s, when the PLO insistently called for the Palestinian people to realize their right to self-determination, which Palestinians had been demanding since 1919 in official documents, Israel countered with the so-called, and I quote, Israeli, but read Jewish, self-determination. This was expressed in September 1972 by Israel's foreign minister, again, Aubrey Solomon, the famed Abba Eban, who declared that Israeli self-determination, and I quote him, should take moral and historical precedence over Palestinian self-determination, though it does not rule it out completely or entirely. Mind you, he used the word Israeli. He was, I think, too ashamed to say at the time just Jewish, but of course what he meant was Jewish, because he distinguished between Palestinians and Israeli Jews. Eban's recognition harks back to the assertions and statements by Ben-Gurion and Weizmann since the 1920s, which placed the Jewish right of conquest of Palestine as superior to the Palestinians' right of self-determination. In the meantime, pro-Israel US academics began to market Zionism since the 1960s and increasingly in the 1980s as an anti-colonial enterprise and as the movement of national liberation of the Jewish people. A novel expression engineered to efface its colonial settler nature, which the movement, ironically, never denied previously. Even like the Biltmore program spoke about what a great example of colonization that they were doing. I mean, these were not things that, and this is 1942, right? In recent decades, the Israeli government has been obsessing about the dwindling numbers of Israeli Jews and rising numbers of Palestinians. Its strategy to alter these demographics, and it had several national conferences with strategies and study groups and research to undo this by increasing Jewish immigration and the Jewish birth rate and to reduce the Palestinian birth rate. All these strategies have proven a complete failure. It is in light of these demographic realities that Zionist and Israeli propagandists began to speak increasingly of Jewish self-determination rather than Israeli self-determination, as Eban had done in the 1970s, when Israel was still successful in camouflaging its Jewish supremacist character to Western liberals, which really hardly ever need convincing anyway. If the Zionist leaders, if for Zionist leaders, Jewish or Israeli self-determination took precedence over Palestinian self-determination between the 1920s and the 1970s, which is why the Zionists would never allow the Palestinians to exercise it. Today, the Palestinians, as the Knesset declared in 2018, have no such right at all, if they did, if they ever did. And the Jewish right to Palestine has become, quote unquote, exclusive and continues to take precedence, as Eban had informed us. The new law, however, does not signal a change in Zionist or Israeli policy. As I have just demonstrated, nothing stipulated in the 2018 Basic Law is novel ideologically, or in terms of any of the policies Israel and the Zionist movement pursued since the 1920s. It should be noted that the law's reference to the land of Israel, Eretz Israel, rather than to the state of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people and where Jews have an exclusive right to self-determination, with which, of course, the recent ADL reaffirmation is fully congruent, anticipates the Jewish colonial minority's control over the whole of historic Palestine, and is fully in line with the expansionist foundations of Israel in 1948, and why the country could not then be named Eretz Israel. The ADL, US academic marketers of Israel, and Israeli officials trot out the so-called Jewish self-determination argument as superior to Palestinian self-determination in order to safeguard the Zionist colonial project and Jewish supremacy in Israel, which they have supported and continue to support unapologetically. The hypocrisy, however, lies with American and European Jewish and Christian liberals, let alone their Israeli Jewish counterparts, who feign shock over the nation-state law or even last week's elections, which brought Benjamin Netanyahu and his Zionist religious allies back to power, and whom Western liberals consider somehow more Jewish supremacists than Ben-Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, Abba Eban, or any of Israel's other leaders. Dalia Schneidlin, a US political scientist, published a column in the New York Times last week heralding the collapse of Israeli democracy. She is most worried about Israel's recent illiberalism, which, according to her, started in 2009, when Benjamin Netanyahu came to power. She avers that, quote, the apex of this illiberal legislative frenzy was the nation-state law of 2018, a new basic law elevating Jews to a higher status than all other citizens, unquote. But Jews had already had a higher status ensured by Israel's declaration of itself as a Jewish state since 1948, and legally beginning with the law of return in 1950, the law of absentee property in 1952, on, with about 65 such laws. Not to mention the appeal to the priority and precedence of Jewish colonial rights over Palestinian indigenous rights, as articulated by Ben-Gurion in the 20s, Weizmann in the 30s, and Abba Eban in the 1970s. The invocation of Jewish self-determination in the land of the Palestinians since the 1970s has been the major camouflage to embellish the reigning regime of Jewish supremacy in Israel. However, neither the 2018 nation-state law nor the new Jewish supremacist government, which Netanyahu is now putting together, signals a change, major or minor, in the status of Jews or of Palestinians in Israel and its occupied territories. The only change they augur is the explicitness of Israel's ongoing commitment to Jewish supremacy, but without any more embellishment. The panic this has induced in Israeli and pro-Israeli US and European liberals is that no amount of repetition of and appeal to the notion of Jewish self-determination can any longer undo this Israeli explicit commitment to Jewish supremacy. Thank you.
This on? Yeah, Joseph, I've never heard anything so detailed in dissecting this issue. And I'm intrigued. Of course. Yeah, and I was really intrigued by your reference to the early Israeli leaders about the roots of the Palestinians being non-Palestinian, as if we came from the moon. So I recall a study by Hebrew University when genealogy became available and genetic testing became available that showed that most of the Israelis have no connection to the land, while the Palestinians are the original Canaanites who lived there ever since history.
It's why not the actual descendants of the ancient Hebrews who converted to Christianity and Islam.
And that too as well.
I mean, it's so funny, like no one would ever question Egyptians today claiming direct descent from the pharaohs or ancient Egyptians. No one has the audacity to actually in any way question modern Iraqis' claim that they are descendants of the Babylonians. But the Palestinians somehow cannot claim their ancient Hebrew ancestors because some strange European population claims them as their ancestors. It's very funny. I don't support any of these claims. I think they're problematic anyway. But logically, it seems to me, if these are accepted, why not this? It's just
Right. That metamorphosis of the arguments that the Israelis had through the years is really a lesson in deception, I would say. So I'll open the floor for questions, and please make them concise and direct. We have till 11 o'clock for questions and answers. Hopefully, we'll accommodate everybody.
do people online get
And people online have access. Please let me know if we have any questions. I saw the first hand right here, Dr. Musa.
Good morning. Thank you for this very nice details. I am one of the 400,000 who first were kicked out. So I'm one of them. But what I want to know, you mentioned the Palestinians and the Israelis and the population. And I want to give one example here. Is President Zelensky has an Israeli passport. How many Zelenskys in the world are considered Israelis? And they never live in Israel, some of them. Thank you.
Well, the question of demographics, of course, is very difficult because the Israelis control it. And their method of counting who is or is not Jewish is also guarded by them. And it's unclear also, I mean, there's probably over 1 million Israeli Jews of Israeli nationality living abroad between the US and elsewhere, who are usually counted as part of the population. So it's very difficult to know. And I mean, what we do know is that initially the Israeli state, because it's a religious and theocratic state. Is this me or? Can you try that also? Okay, I want to stand because of my back, but I can use it while standing. So can you hear me now? Yeah. So the question is, so the Israeli state after 1948 considered someone as Jewish by halachic law, meaning they have to have a Jewish mother, right? Whereas by the late 1960s, they adopted Hitler's understanding of what Jews should be. Hitler, of course, had introduced a law to establish both Aryan and everyone's racial background, and if you had more than one grandparent, for example, who was Jewish, then you'd be a Jew. If you had more than one, so if you had less, you could be an Aryan German. So the Israelis actually began to adopt this, I think, in 1968 or 69 as the new way of regulating who is Jewish. And as a result, anyone who is, on whom these criteria or to whom these criteria apply, can, along with his or her spouse, his or her parents, his or her children, now come to Israel, even if the rest of them are not Jewish, right? So this is part also of how Israeli Jewish citizenship is established since the late 60s.
That was not my question. My question is,
Yes.
They say Israel is 6 million.
Yes.
How many of these?
We don't know.
6 million, like you don't know.
Yeah, I understood your question, which is why I said we don't really know. Well, but let's not forget that, of course, the largest contingent of the early colonists of Palestine were Ukrainian Jews, right? So Ukraine has had a very, very important colonial history to Palestine. And aside from the dual nationality issue, aside from the people who live abroad, point well taken, which we cannot establish, let's also remember those who actually remain colonists and descendants of Ukrainian colonists. Yeah, no, I understand.
Yeah, I think Dr. Khoury has the mic, and then I'm going to ask 2 or 3 people to ask the questions and give Dr. Massad the forum.
To be Jewish, the mother has to be a Jew because you don't trust the father.
Only according to the halakha, not according to Israeli law.
This is, an unbelievable expose of the Palestinian history, and nobody can add or question any part of it. it's a good platform to use to explain our situation to our American friends and colleagues. What I took the microphone for is make two announcements. Number one is that our Palestinian population in America is making huge strides. One of these strides is that our esteemed MC is the recipient of the American College of Surgeons Philanthropic Volunteer Award. This is not a simple achievement. It's well deserved, a great honor. Second announcement is his birthday today.
Happy birthday.
I'll take two questions right here, and I need somebody from there. Okay, yeah, you'll get the mic.
Okay, maybe half a dozen.
I'll try. First of all, wonder more about the role of the United States, including both the Democratic and Republican parties, but also the American left. The other might be about the role of the Soviet Union. Anyway, anything you can say about any of those.
You mean historically in 47?
Yeah.
No, of course, I mean, the Americans were big supporters, of course. Not only that, of course, it was, they had an important role even during the war to negotiate. I mean, the United Nations sent Americans to also do this. The Soviets changed their line on Palestine. The Soviet line against Zionism began with the Russian Revolution from 1917 onwards, right? So, are we still having an issue with? Can we just have one mic working until we finish this situation? Okay. Okay, so the Soviets continued to have an anti-Zionist line, of course. We can, I mean, I can speak from there. Yeah, I guess not use any of them. People can't hear me online.
Firas, if you can switch off all the other mics and just leave one of the ones on the panelist table. Thank you.
Is it done? Yeah. Now we're all. Does this one work? Is this one? Let's just fix that problem so that people also online can hear. Just bear with us. Technical difficulties. Yes. Yay. Okay. I don't know what to do. I don't know. All right. So no, it's not working. It's not working.
An expert in subsystems here, raise your hand.
Or like
So while we're getting that ready, get your questions short and sweet to the board.
we just need one that works without Hello. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, is this good? Can you hear me from here? Yeah. From here? Okay. So, in the 1920s, of course, the Soviet Union continued to be very anti-Zionist, although at the beginning, some Zionist operatives continued to operate until the late 1920s in the Soviet Union, until all Zionist activity became criminalized. At the time, of course, in around 1922, 1923, The Soviet government was very, very concerned about the situation of displaced Jews who had been targeted by the White armies funded by Churchill and by the British to kill Jews as part of the Tsarist army's anti-Semitism. As a result, the Pale of Settlement, where the majority of Jews lived in Tsarist times, had been abandoned, and Jews became landless refugees and homeless refugees. At the time, I'm giving up on it's a long story because, of course, it goes back to the late 18th century when the Tsars began to invest in agricultural colonization for Jews and other Russians from the Pale of Settlement to settle all the recently occupied northern Ottoman areas, including the Crimea, including what becomes Odessa, which actually is a Russian colonial settler city built on the Ottoman city of Haji Bey after its conquest. So with this program of Jewish agricultural colonization, which begins in the late 18th century by Catherine the Great and the Russian Tsars, by 1922, you have several Jewish agricultural settler colonies across the Kherson province, all of this area that we hear about a lot today in Ukraine and in the Crimea. So the Soviets at the time didn't know how to handle the situation. They were still in a war. There was a civil war, and they were invaded by 14 invasions, including by 14 armies, including by the US. So they were approached by an American philanthropic Jewish organization who had tried to help the Jews charitably who were affected by World War I, and they concluded a new deal, half funded by the Soviet government, half by the American organization called Agro Joint, to actually settle at least 200,000 Jews or more in agricultural colonies that the Soviets would create with this funding across southern Ukraine and the Crimea. This would continue until the early 1930s. There was, of course, a major Crimean Tatar uprising against their lands being given to Jewish colonists. And subsequently, Stalin would have to give up on that project. And they had another project called the Birobidzhan project, where they created a Jewish self-ruling region on the China border at that time. And many American Jews and Latin American Jews and German Jews were leaving their countries and going to live in Birobidzhan as the new Jewish national group. So in some way, the Soviets were anti-Zionist, but they still seemed to be interested in some form of Jewish agricultural colonization within the Soviet Union. Now, this continued to be the policy, anti-Zionism remained the policy until after World War II. After World War II, you begin to see a change in policy. Several meetings between the Zionist leadership in Palestine take place at the Soviet embassy in Istanbul, but also in London. The Soviets at the time had a large number of ambassadors in the West that were Soviet Jews, including the ambassador to the US, the ambassador to Mexico, the ambassador to Britain, who were, of course, anti-Zionist. Some of them were approached by the Zionist leadership and would come to Palestine to check out what was happening. Slowly, the situation would begin to change by 1945, 1946, especially as the Arab feudal leadership and reactionary leadership across the Arab world were now fully under the thumb of the British, especially after the British had them set up something called the League of Arab States as another instrument for British control of the Arab world. So the Soviets were now concerned that, these people are claiming that they are with the reactionary powers, whereas the Zionist leadership is claiming to be socialist and wanting to emulate us. So you begin to see a change, so much so that Andrei Gromyko, who later, of course, is famous as the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, who was at the time the representative at the United Nations, would give the most impassioned speech in April and May 1947, when they were still discussing the partition plan in support of one state to grant self-determination to both people, something the Soviet Union had always opposed. But then failing that, he claimed, and this was the plan, then at least a partition between the Palestinians and the Jews. So this is when things begin to change, and that kind of honeymoon doesn't last for very long. Of course, the Soviet Union was the first country to recognize Israel juridically and de jure, followed by the US. But this would change only after 1953, when relations would begin to sour between them and Israel. But they never stopped or withdrew their recognition of Israel. So that is very clear, that even though at some point they cut off relations, they actually never stopped recognizing.
Gentlemen, as far back, please.
Mentioned, I just wonder why it isn't stressed more in terms of the failure of 181. As you said, there were 500,000 Jews in what's called the Jewish state. But out of that 500,000, you call them colonists, but most of them are really just dissidents. It's like it's almost stacking the cards, you know, you pile people in there. I've made my own estimation, about 500,000, only 150,000 may have been born there or had some investment there. And I'm just wondering why that isn't stressed more as being one failure of 181, that they really didn't make their calculations quite correct.
But that's not actually accurate. Okay.
Any questions from that side? Right there, please. Just go ahead.
So my question is just, you gave an excellent background in history. I'll try to speak out. Of the Zionist movement as being a political organization, a political movement. I'm just curious now from your research in contemporary Israel, how much of the population thinks of their right, you know, as their right to exist as a word of God, as a religious right to all the land of Israel or Jerusalem.
Yeah, let me just handle these two because then I'll forget. So the first question, no, your description is actually inaccurate. The British, of course, legalized Jewish colonization in the country in the 1925 law that they passed for Palestinian nationality. That law already denationalized at least 40,000 Palestinians who were living in Latin America or in Europe at that time. And they gave them about like 6 months or so, initially 2 years, and then 6 months to come back and get Palestinian nationality, which of course they couldn't, because remember, when these Palestinians left to work in Latin America, they had an Ottoman nationality. After 1924 and the Lausanne Agreement, Ottoman nationality was no longer possible for the people who had it before. Now people have to get new nationalities, Syrian, Lebanese, Jordanian. So in 1925, the order in council that was issued by the British denationalized upwards of 40,000 Palestinians, mostly Christians in Latin America, who were working but sending money home and often coming, and they couldn't come back, of course, to obtain Palestinian citizenship. In the meantime, it facilitated the acquisition of any European Jew coming to the country to get nationality. This is how, in fact, in 1917, right before the British occupation, the Jewish population of the country was less than 9 or 8%. And suddenly it became upwards of 33% under the British. So the British facilitated this move. And of course, while a large number of Jews who came to Palestine in the first decade of British rule also ended up leaving, and it was not a mass movement, by the time Hitler came to power, then it would become a much larger movement, especially after 1933. And by 1934, you were getting now, instead of 3,000 or 4,000, 50 or 60,000 people who and by 1930, we're getting now 1,000, 50,000.
It is a conspiracy. Let's go ahead and speak. I'll just wait for this slide.
So as a result, these were actually refugees that the doors of European countries and the US were closed to, and they had very few places to go except for Palestine. So they were actually refugees. So they were not Zionists. We need to please eliminate the sound system because this is just not right. So they were not Zionists.
I think after this we take a break and
Let's turn it off to the Q&A. I want to continue the Q&A without.
Just kind of-
unsuccessfully, I would say. Really? Okay, so that, so they were not really visitors. Also, of course, what I wanted to say is that most of these people came to Palestine not because they were Zionists. They were not, Zionism had failed to garner the support of the majority of Jews. Those who ended up there were Jews who had no other place to go. So it's not that they went there because they were followers of the Zionist movement. They went there because they were ready.
Do you have any other questions?
There was another question.
Yeah,
I don't think, I don't make a distinction. I don't make a distinction between the religious and the secular, of course, because mostly, even, the so-called secular Zionists always claim that God had given it to them, right? So Ben-Gurion would say, I understand why the Palestinians would not accept our claim. Our God who gave it to us is not their God. Why should they actually believe this, right? So, even someone like Ben-Gurion, who was an atheist, still invoke the issue of God as, as a real estate agent or Zionism. But, and God has often been. But the point simply being that I'm not really sure that only religious Jews believe that God gave it. Of course, the religious Jews are historically more active because they say most of our history is actually in Judea, because in the West Bank, not in Israel. Why do we care about the state of Israel? Really, what we want is Judea. That's where our history was, right? So they're actually, in that sense, based on the Bible as a geography book, if you will, or as a history book, they claim Judea as the real place where everything had happened rather than Tel Aviv, for example.
Any other questions? I see you take the last two questions from here and the back. This will be the last two.
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
And so, part of it, as I'm sure you know, is that, for instance, the crowd, wrong to and a lot of the iconography and art look very Aryan. And there was a lot of denial of any association. They wanted to remove all their past associations with the ugly, horrible, Jews. So I would say that yes, there was the connection of Jews and right? Historical and connection, but I think also
yes and no. I mean, remember many of the founders were either West European, the ideological founders, West European Jews who had been since the 19th century quite inimical to East European Jews, whose presence, whose poverty and subsequent immigration after the 1870s to Western Europe undermined their position. And they were sort of, very Germanized. So, but even those who were not, for example, Arthur Rupin came from East European stock, but because he lived in Posen, the part of Russia that had been colonized by the Germans, by Prussia, since the late 18th century, and whose Jewish population had been fully Germanized, he saw himself as a German, and indeed, he would actually have racial, and Arthur Rupin is very important. He is the actual architect and engineer of the takeover of the land. He would set up the Palestine Land Development Corporation in 1908, and he's the one who would buy a lot of this land. Rupin, for example, would theorize that actually Ashkenazi Jews are Aryan and Indo-European, and he goes back to history and say they are actually Hittites. Unlike the Bedouin and the Sephardi Jews who may be Semitic, we are actually Aryan and Indo-European. And he was very, very good friends, for example, with the founders of the German youth movement, the von der Vogels, for example, and the Zionists would later have the Blau und Weiß, sort of the blue and white youth organization, in many ways sort of imitating a lot of the German youth movement from which ultimately the Nazis would emerge. But this aside, it's they still relied on biblical claims, right? But also on some genetic claims. The idea, this is a Protestant idea from the 16th century. I hope everyone is clear that really Protestants are the real enemy of the story. But it's the Protestant Reformation that actually So the Protestant Reformation is actually where much of this begins, right? So kind of the new crusade by the 15th century, the last crusades were almost now completely sort of retreating in the background, and the Reformation now was in many ways interested in this project of the millenarians of returning quote unquote European Jews to Palestine. So the idea that they were not European, and this is very strange because you would think, I mean, European Jews, like European Christians, are converts to these strange Palestinian religions. If the European Jewish converts are somehow claimed to be descendants of the early Jews of Palestine, then why are European Christians also not claiming that they are descendants of the early Palestinian Christians? It's a very strange, because they're both converts, right? So it's a very strange type of understanding, but it begins with the Protestants, of course. And remember, the colonization of Palestine actually begins at the beginning of the 19th century by Protestants, right? So in 1808, you have this, and of course, the British here have a horrific history long before the Mandate. In 1808, in the late 18th century, you begin to have this messianic and evangelical revival in Britain. So you have, of course, first of all, the horrific church missionary society known in our part of the world as the CMS, a horrific sort of racist missionary school system that goes to West Africa, to New Zealand, and to Palestine and Jordan. My own sister, of course, studied at this deservedly much maligned school, but in Amman. But then, of course, they created the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity amongst the Jews. At the beginning of the 19th century, Britain had less than 8,000 Jews, actually. So they were very interested in the German Jews under Lutheranism and in transforming them to Anglicans. So many of the early, and the idea was to spread Anglicanism amongst German Jews and other European Jews. So the first Jews that they began to convert came from Germany. And indeed, one of them, who was a rabbi, had become a bishop in Britain. By the late 1830s, when Muhammad Ali's occupation of Palestine made it possible for the British to open the first British consulate in Jerusalem, the British insisted on building an Anglican Protestant church in Jerusalem, unheard of previously under Ottoman rule. And who do they bring, you think, as the first bishop of Palestine, Anglican bishop? A German Jewish convert from a rabbi into a bishop who was brought on a British frigate to become the first bishop of Palestine, because they thought this would facilitate and attract more Jews to convert to Anglicanism and move to Palestine, right? So it begins at the beginning of the 19th century. So the British and the Protestant rule, and of course, this is also when American evangelicals begin to set up colonies in Palestine, in Jaffa, near Bethlehem. Some, fanatical evangelical Christians who set up several colonies. They subsequently, of course, followed by German fanatical evangelicals who come in and call themselves the Templars. And then even you have the Spaffords, the strange American family from Chicago, who come in and they purchase a Hosseini family palace outside of the walls, where they set up their colony, and they're followed by Swedish evangelicals. And then, of course, some of you might know that lovely place today as the American Colony Hotel in Jerusalem. Yeah, but just so that you know how important it is, that basically the whole project was a Protestant Christian project to convert European Jews and bring them as Christians to Palestine. When that failed by the 1880s and the Zionist Jewish project began to compete, the British said, well, fine, at least, then European Jews can control it as Jews, fine, but, not as Protestants. So it's a very interesting project, but let it be known, it's the Protestants who are the guilt. With the Protestants that the guilt lies.
We have 1 minute for the last question, right there, please.
Yes.
So now we're seeing that there's we're in the school on the minus project with for racial justice, but it's matter and human conditions sovereignty. So looking forward, how does this complicate or shape, if at all, how Israel self-identifies and it's no longer to capture the state, and either again recreate or redefine its identity or continue as
it's the same project all along. This is nothing new. The idea that, the Zionists basically appeal to European imperial powers to sponsor the project began initially because of the Protestant interest, which they knew very, very well, with the existing sort of Protestant colonies and the project, the millenarian project of Central Palestine. So, but they worked on the issue of victimization, which is of course true. The victimization of Jews. Of course, Jews were not the only oppressed group in Europe, but they were one of the groups that were sort of in the forefront of those who had been oppressed and victimized. So that was always used, right? So this is, you begin to see this also in the, the Declaration of the Establishment of the State of Israel says that the world owes us a homeland. They say that explicitly, fine, but not the Palestinians. I have no problem that the Germans should. I still believe in the division of Germany. I think the two-state solution is the best solution for Germany. But this aside, the point remains that it is, this is still working. Okay. So the point remains that it's not actually anything new to present it this way. But remember, I always say, the Zionists are just not original thinkers at all, right? So the idea, first of all, that they are victims, the Boers were victims, right? They were put in concentration camps. The African-American colonists of Liberia who oppressed the native Africans were, of course, slaves who had just been freed in the US and went there to oppress also native Africans in the name of Christianity and in the name of freedom. The American white colonists, who claimed that they were oppressed in Europe for religious reasons, which somehow justified the conquest of the lands of Native Americans for them. There's nothing unique in this. The idea that natives want to throw the colonists in the sea, this comes from Africa, right? So the Portuguese and the German ambassadors at the League of Nations in the 1920s claimed, we here at the native Africans want to throw our German colonists in the sea. So this comes when the Zionist Jews use this, it's actually followed from them. The idea that we are returning to the land is hardly new. This is exactly what the French and the Italians said when they went to Algeria and Libya. They said, in fact, that this is our land, this is the Roman Empire, the Arabs are the new colonists, we are returning to the Roman Empire. Nothing the Zionists came up with was actually original. There are such lazy thinkers and limits. It's truly amazing. It's always surprising to me that not a single interesting idea is original. All of them come from other colonial experiences. Yeah. So again, and I think the idea that we are, that of racial justice. But of course, it was what they forget is that the majority of non-Jewish Zionists, of Christian Zionists, historically and at present, have always been anti-Semitic. When they claim that anti-Zionists are anti-Semitic, probably some anti-Zionists are anti-Semitic, but we do know that the majority of pro-Zionists are anti-Semitic. So the struggle would be against the pro-Zionists, whom we know, especially the evangelicals and other ones that are indeed part of this anti-Semitic understanding of Jews. Now, the anti-Zionists, some may very well be, but of course, the majority of anti-Zionists who organize in progressive circles, which is where anti-Zionists usually organize, have always made a distinction that is never made by Israel and Zionists between Jews and between Zionists. And this is why I always accuse Israel and those who defend it of being anti-Semitic. When Israel says, we do what we do in the name of Jews, that is an anti-Semitic line. We blame the Israeli government and the leadership of the Zionist movement for oppressing the Palestinians, not the Jewish people. But Israel claims that it oppresses the Palestinians for the sake of the Jewish people. Listen, the anti-Semitic claim is Israel's, not those who oppose its policies. Yeah?
Well, that's